The fascinating history of feudal Japan, the Kamakura period, the Muromachi period, and the Azuchi Momoyama period were the three primary periods that comprised the era of feudal Japan. A military dictator designated by the emperor, known as a shogun, was in charge of Japan during each of these periods. Shoguns were in charge of the country at the time. The years 1185 AD to 1603 AD were the years that Japan was under feudal rule. Between the emperor and the imperial court, the shoguns were the most powerful members of society in Japan. Throughout this period in the country's history, in feudal societies, the shoguns distributed land to their devoted followers, and several stewards and constables were responsible for managing the estates that were owned by these faithful followers. Japan was not the first nation to operate under a feudal system. Nonetheless, the feudalism that existed in Japan was distinct from the feudalism that existed in Europe. Even though the Jito territory stewards and Shugo military constables did not initially possess any land of their own, they gradually gained authority over time, and as a result, became enormous landowners. It was also at this time that the Jito and Shugo began to create their private armies and became capable of opposing the governments of the shogunate. The Jito and Shugo gradually gained more and more power, which ultimately led to the collapse of this feudal society, the beginnings of the feudal system and its organization. In its most basic form, feudalism is a system in which rulers favored their subordinates by providing them with land, titles, and prominent jobs in exchange for their service in the military. A man named Minamoto no Yoritomo, who appointed himself as the Shogun of Japan in the year 1192 AD, is credited with being the primary founder of this system. During his tenure as shogun, Yoritomo exercised authority over the Japanese emperor, as well as the royal court. As was noted briefly, several countries in Europe operated under a feudal system. Nonetheless, Japan's form of government was quite distinctive. The feudal system in Japan was less based on contracts and more on a personal accord between the lords and the vassal subordinates, in which the lords were viewed as father figures. This was the case in Japan. The term oya, which translates to parent, was frequently used to refer to lords. The shoguns in Japan benefited tremendously from the feudal system since it gave them the ability to exercise authority over the majority of their region. Unfortunately, the system was ultimately unsuccessful, since there were no official institutions of government in place when Kamakura was in power. It was during the Kamakura period of feudal Japan, which spanned from 1192 AD to 1333 AD, that the feudal system was firmly formed. This period covered the years 1192 AD to 1333 AD. Minamoto Yoritomo was the monarch during this period, and the period itself was named after the city in which Yoritomo initially built the capital of his military government. The Kamakura Shogunate was the name given to this particular government. The era of the Muromachi War. The Muromachi period of feudal Japan lasted from approximately 1336 AD to 1573 AD and was ruled by the Muromachi Shogunate. This period was known as the Muromachi period. This period in Japan's history was characterized by a great degree of political upheaval. Nonetheless, it was also a time of significant cultural development, particularly under the influence of Zen Buddhism. For instance, during this period, the Japanese arts of the tea ceremony, flower arranging, and no play, which is a sort of traditional Japanese dance drama, were formed. In addition, the Muromachi period was the time when the Sung style of ink painting achieved its highest level of popularity. In the course of the Muromachi period, the regional warlords, who were referred to as daimyo, amassed a substantial amount of power, which therefore resulted in a decrease in the authority of the shogun. The daimyo could acquire this authority because they were in control of the samurai, who were a highly skilled and prestigious group of Japanese warriors. During the time of Azuchi Momoyama, the period of Azuchi Momoyama, which occurred during the feudal era in Japan, lasted from approximately 1574 AD to 1600 AD. During this period, the daimyo Oda Nobunaga spearheaded the process of social unification. To bring all of Japan's provinces under the authority of the central government, it was Nobunaga, along with his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was responsible for the task. During the Azuchi Momoyama period, there was a strong emphasis on opulence and flamboyance. It was at this time that the traditional style of temples was replaced by the construction of a large number of big castles and houses. In reality, the period is named after two well-known castles, Azuchi, which was constructed by Oda Nobunaga, and Momoyama, which was constructed by Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Both of these castles were constructed in Japan. The year 1598 AD saw the passing of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, which led to the rise to power of a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the first shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan. He rose to the position of shogun after being appointed to the position by the emperor. This period, which can be referred to as the Edo period, and spanned from the year 1600 AD to the year 1868 AD, was characterized by a period of high wealth and harmony. A stringent class system was also implemented during the Tokugawa shogunate, which essentially isolated Japanese society from the rest of the world. This occurred throughout the shogunate. How did feudal Japan come to an end? Within the framework of the feudal system, the Jito and the Shugo were one of the most significant sources of contention. The Jito and Shugo were able to maintain their influence in the provinces primarily due to the widespread support they received from the people who lived there. Because of this, during times when the shogunate government was experiencing periods of weakness, the samurai warriors and certain landowners failed to pay their taxes in full because there was no legal contract in place. There were occasions when the samurai and landowners went so far as to overturn the agreements that had been made between the lords and the vassals to enrich themselves with power and money. Another significant flaw in the feudal system in Japan was that the Jito and Shugo were entirely dependent on the resources available in their immediate vicinity for their profits. As a result of the fact that they did not receive their money from the central government in Japan, their allegiances were frequently violated, and they were more prone to establish agreements that were beneficial to themselves. As a consequence of this, the shogunate became an irrelevant institution on a regional scale. The majority of the time, these self-serving arrangements were struck between authorities and farmers in the form of a piece of land being traded in exchange for a delay in the payment of taxes. The entire structure of land ownership in Japan was altered as a result of these negotiations. This was because a single stretch of land may be owned by many parties, including private persons, government officials, religious institutions, the shogunate, and the crown. When the Jito started to accumulate debt, more issues started to arise. It was a problem that the Jito were not receiving sufficient funds from their dads to be able to make a life, especially considering that the funds had to be distributed among several siblings. The result of this was that a great number of Jitsu were compelled to mortgage their right to receive income from an estate, which resulted in them incurring substantial debt. Over time, it became increasingly difficult to obtain new land and titles to reward vassals in exchange for their loyalty, which resulted in the feudal system becoming even more feeble.